And my name is Martin Bush, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm part of the Replicats team, and I'm the current secretary of AMOS. Thanks so much for joining us for this session, connecting Metascience to established science studies fields. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country, and I would like to acknowledge that I am seated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as other speakers in this session are, and indeed as this conference is being virtually hosted from. Other speakers with us today are speaking from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and from further afield. Wherever you are within Australia, you exist on Indigenous Australian land, the sovereignty of which was never ceded, and around the world, the relationship to knowing and country with Indigenous people is ancient and continuing. These acknowledgements can be formulaic, but was ask you to just think about and reflect about what is meaningful to you, and to think about the stories of the land that you're on and that you have been on. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend a special welcome to any Indigenous colleagues who may be with us today. So the theme of this session is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's connecting, how do we think about connecting metascience to more established fields of science studies? And Brian Nosek noted in this morning's plenary that, you know, it's one of the things that's been a feature of recent times in metascience, that we've started to have these conversations with existing disciplines in science studies. And, you know, for example, in this year so far, we've had discussions at the Metascience Forum, at the 4S SGS conference, as well as in individual symposiums and seminars hosted by the Centre for Open Science and History and Philosophy of Science here at the University of Melbourne. So, you know, we're so pleased to be continuing that conversation today, because it's really interesting and important to reflect on the ways that both metascience is different from, yet can connect with other fields of studies. And we've got three fantastic speakers for you today. In speaking order, we're going to have Remco Heesen speaking on his peer review, A Good Idea, Fallon Mody speaking on placing the meta-research movement in historical perspective, and Felipe Romero speaking on the many faces of scientific self-correction. I'll give slightly more introduction to each speaker when we start. But, you know, sort of noting that this is format of this session, since it's the first day of this conference, some people, like myself, might be getting used to the precise format. So we'll hear for 15 minutes of presentation from each speaker. We'll have a bit of collective discussion time, up to 15 minutes on all of the presentations. Then we'll go into breakout rooms based around each of the speakers and rotate around them. Finally, a note on that we are recording this session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please do turn your camera off and just use the chat facility for putting any comments or questions in. The breakout sessions will not be recorded, so feel free to participate them in the fullest possible way. So over to our first speaker, Remco Heesen, speaking on Is Peer Review a Good Idea? Remco is an academic philosopher whose research analyzes the social structure of science using a combination of methods from philosophy, economic, mathematics, and statistics. His recent work focuses on the epistemic consequences of scientists' decisions regarding journal publications. Such questions include how and why do scientists choose to share a given result rather than keeping it secret, and how can peer review be biased even when individual editors and reviewers are not biased. Remco, please.
Thanks, Martin, for that lovely introduction. I will just go ahead and share my screen. And I hope that someone will shout if that's not working properly. Right, so let me also start by acknowledging that I'm delivering this talk from the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'll just second everything that Martin already said on that topic. It's worth reflecting on, but I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to move on now. So this talk is going to be sort of a bird's eye overview of my work on the topic of peer review from the perspective of academic philosophy. In particular, I'm drawing from two papers. The paper that the presentation is named after is called "Is Peer Review a Good Idea?" co-written with Liam Kofi-Bright, and the other one with, again, Liam and Marcus Arvan is called Jury Theorems for Peer Review. I've included the links here, and the slides will be made available later if you want to look those up. Because I only have 15 minutes, right, I'm going to be going through some of the aspects of this very quickly, just to give you a flavor of the kind of arguments that my co-authors and myself are trying to put forward in these papers, rather than being able to go into all the details. But they are available in the papers and in somewhat more detail in the slides when they're published. Right, so peer review, I don't have to introduce that in this crowd. It's a very important thing that we do in the sciences. And my particular interest in this talk will be in manuscript peer review, as opposed to conference, for example, or grants. So we mostly, by and large, use pre-publication peer review at academic journals to determine what sorts of things get published and where they get published. Of course, there's some experimentation going on with that, but this is still the dominant model. And the thing I'm going to be interested in this talk is comparing that dominant model to an alternative in which peer review is open and it's post-publication peer review in a crowdsourced kind of way. So the open here refers to at least two differences with the traditional model. It's open in the sense that anyone that wants to can offer a peer review, right? So it's the crowdsourced aspect, but it's also open in the sense that anyone can read the peer reviews. They are stored together with the paper for anyone to see. So the idea is that someone publishes a paper simply by making it available on the OSF or the archive or whatever format it might be. And then the discipline comes together to discuss the paper in public in reviews that they can post as kind of like a comment section on the paper. They might also give scores to the paper. And that's going to be the way we carry out peer review after something is published. So the interest from a philosophical perspective is what kind of arguments can we make for one proposal for organizing these things over another, right? So it's a normative discussion. What's the best way of doing this? Or what are better or worse ways in particular is what I'm interested in here, because I'm not arguing that the proposal I'm putting forward here is the best of all possible worlds, but that it's at least superior, in my view, and that of my co-authors, I guess, I hope, that it's superior to the dominant model of journal-solicited peer review. And so the form of the argument is to make a big laundry list of all the little aspects, the factors, the dimensions that are affected by how we organize peer review in science, the various little things that we do that interact with peer review, and sort of systematically go through them and see how they're affected if you change how we do peer review, and then make a kind of Pareto-style argument that for each factor, we either expect no change or some kind of improvement from changing our organization of peer review. And that is all according to a standard that I call epistemic consequentialism. So I'm not going to be focused here, for example, on ethical considerations. The question is just something like, how can we get the most scientific knowledge as efficiently as possible out of the time invested in scientific research. Great. So the factors that I mentioned are divided into three categories: the positive ones, the neutral ones, and there's two uncertain factors I'm going to mention. So factors where I think the reason why they're like the neutral factors, except that there's just really a big lack of evidence to categorize them confidently. Okay, so yeah, especially with the positive factors, I'm going to move really quickly. The details are available elsewhere. So what kind of benefits do we see from moving to this kind of open crowdsourced peer review model? One is that you can share scientific results more quickly, at least for those who don't need to wait for peer reviews to come in. They can start building on things immediately. They don't have to wait for it to be peer reviewed. Scientists are more free to allocate their own time. What do they want to review? How much time do they want to be spending reviewing? We think there's potentially efficiency gains there. Insofar as there's gender bias in peer review, or even just the expectation of gender bias in peer review, there are potentially gains to be had from that as well. Library resource is kind of an obvious point, right? If you do an archive-style publishing model, you basically cut out for-profit publishers. We all know that there's a lot of money to be gained from doing that. So we think that's a good thing. Libraries can then spend that on other epistemically worthy purposes. There are, of course, going to be impacts on scientific careers, right? Peer review and journals play an important role in how we evaluate scientific careers. That would change. We see potential benefits there. I won't go into the details in this talk. And then there's the power of gatekeepers, right? So currently you have this sort of small cabal of journal editors who, for a given field, control what is published. They have at least a very big say in how people, the rest of the field, are dividing their attention over scientific work. In the alternative sort of crowdsource model, this would be, we see this as a more democratic model of evaluation of scientific results. And we think there's reason to believe, reasons that I'm going to go into in a second actually, that this will be epistemically beneficial as well, that you get better, you get stronger, more reliable scientific knowledge if you have a more broad-based democratic model of evaluation. So the point I want to get into now is one of the key reasons why I think we have the current model of journals listed peer review. Right? There's this idea that peer review acts as a kind of epistemic sorting mechanism where we review papers and then we put them into journals based on how good they are, so that the best work ends up in the best journals, mediocre work ends up in the middling journals, and if things are working well, right, the very worst work doesn't get published at all. So that's performing a kind of signaling function. It helps direct the attention of scientists to the best work on any given topic. So there are a couple of questions about this that we might ask. I have some caveats about whether the current model of journal solicited peer review is really succeeding in doing this kind of epistemic sorting. And then there's also the question of whether you even should want to be directing necessarily everyone's attention to the best work, or whether it's actually just better to spread it out. But setting those aside, we might ask the question, how would this alternative crowdsourced model of peer review perform relative to the current model? And here the claim is that by crowdsourcing peer reviews, you're going to benefit from a kind of phenomenon that mathematicians call the wisdom of the crowds. And then you'll get actually better assessments of the quality of scientific work. And so even at this thing that journal solicited peer review is designed to do, this epistemic sorting, crowdsourced peer review can outperform it. Again, for reasons of time, I won't go into the details, right? But so there's the Condorcet-Jury theorem and variations of it that are trying to make precise this idea of the wisdom of the crowds, that are basically going to tell you that more reviewers are going to give a more accurate judgment. And the key assumption that's involved in these results is this idea that each reviewer brings a probabilistically independent judgment. They have some independent information that's relevant to the judgment of the paper. That's what's driving these mathematical results. And so you might be worried that that's not the case, especially in crowdsourced peer review. If it's open, that people are seeing each other's reviews and just copying each other's opinion, that would be a reason to worry that their judgments are not going to be independent. Again, we have a number of things to say about this, but I just want to highlight the bottom point on the slide here, where we say that, look, if we are scientific experts contributing our opinion in a peer review system, I think we have to assume that the sort of expertise, the genuine expertise that we expect these scientific experts to have, involves a certain degree of independence of thought, right? A certain degree of being able to give your own reasons for why a particular contribution is good or bad. If you can't do that, arguably you're not actually an expert. You're maybe just a kind of parrot who has really good sources. So insofar as we're right about this claim about what genuine expertise is, you would expect a pretty strong degree of independence in reviewer opinions. Right. So we have the two neutral factors here. So these are points where we want to sort of either downplay the benefits of our proposal or point out that a benefit you might expect from the present system doesn't really work as well as you expect. So some people think that an important role of peer review is fraud detection. There's really no evidence that it's able to do this in any sort of reliable way. So it's kind of a moot point whether you do journal solicited or crowdsourced peer review isn't really going to affect fraud detection all that much. Some people think that a problem with journal solicited peer review is that it encourages faddishness, but we think that's actually not the case. There's just a general kind of attention economy in science that you won't get rid of just by getting rid of journals. So from that perspective, actually, this is again a case where how exactly you organize peer review is going to make little or no difference. Right. So now we have these two sort of complicated factors where, again, the key point here is that there's just presently really a lack of evidence around them. And so especially in this crowd, I would encourage people that are interested to think about how we might get more evidence on these questions, what kinds of studies or experiments we might do to learn more about these dimensions of how we organize peer review and how we might evaluate which model of peer review ultimately works better. So the first one here is this idea that in the present system, right, the journal model, small fish can seize the headlines, right? A graduate student can publish in Nature, and that's a really important feature of the current system, or so the objection goes, because with the kind of crowdsourced open peer review model, people are only going to read the papers of people that are already famous, and these grad students won't get any attention. So this idea that famous people have an easier time getting attention for their work, we can call that prestige bias, and sometimes it's called the Matthew effect. And so we call this objection the worry about a runaway Matthew effect, right? The idea that we have this much worse than we currently do. So the point that I already mentioned is that we really have no evidence for this, right? So people in maths and physics in particular have been using the archive as a key part of their publishing model for a long time. As far as I know, no one has done a study to see if the Matthew effect has gotten worse in those fields. I would really love to see a study like that. Because we do know, of course, that prestige bias or the Matthew effect is operative in all fields. And the question is, it's really hard to publish in Nature or a fancy journal if you're a grad student because of prestige bias, or partially because of prestige bias. And the question is whether the fact that occasionally a graduate student can get a paper in Nature outweighs the sort of general prestige bias effect that are in place. And so it's really not obvious that we'd be better or worse with a crowdsourced peer review model. The other point I want to raise about this is that if you're very concerned about small fish, be it graduate students or early career researchers, researchers at resource poor universities, researchers in the global south, whichever group you're concerned about, it's good that you're concerned about that. I think we should do more to get attention for the work of these various relatively marginalized groups, but let's do that in a targeted way, right? Let's not just count on Nature's peer review system to occasionally find a hidden gem there, but let's actively go looking for them. And that's roughly orthogonal to the question here about how we organize peer review. Let's just think about ways to direct more attention at these small fish. Okay. The other point is the worry that the comment section will get completely out of hand, right? People are going to form reviewer mobs. If someone alerts them to a paper that has a politically undesirable conclusion, then they're going to get all their friends from Twitter or 4chan or whatever it might be to come in and post bad reviews for that paper, right? And that's bad for several reasons, right? It's just going to make the whole thing really unpleasant. It's going to be bad in particular for the kind of argument that I was running before about the wisdom of the crowds, right? Because if people are just putting bad reviews without reflecting any of their own thinking about the paper, then that's going to undermine the argument that those extra reviews are adding, sort of by increasing our assessment of the real quality of the paper. So here, there are several things we could try to do. We think an experimental attitude would be really valuable to trying to see what would be the best way to not get these mobs to be too distortive. Maybe distinguishing between known experts and putative experts, which would be everyone else, would be a way to get a sense for what's going on in any given case. But I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip towards the conclusion. So I have a quote, but I think I am out of time, right? So I'll just continue on. So this is a quote from the conclusion, and then here I have the list of all the factors that I've discussed, right? So we've got a list of 7 positives and a couple of neutrals and uncertains. And so that all is meant to add up to an argument that crowdsourced open peer review would be better than closed journal solicited peer review. Thanks, I'll hand it back to Martin.
Thank you very much, Remco Heesen. I'll make the effort to pronounce your name at least once correctly in this session. As noted, we'll have a collective question and discussion time after all the presenters. If you have specific questions of clarification or points that you want to raise that are very direct, feel free to put them into chat. That might be an efficient way to deal with them. But at this point, we'll turn over to our next speaker, Fallon Mody, speaking on placing the meta-research movement in historical perspective. Now, Fallon's bio for this session read Research Fellow MetaMelb. And I think that as a colleague and as a fellow communications professional, that's rather burying the lead. So if I may speak on behalf of that, Fallon is the powerhouse behind the Replicates project. He is an amazing historian of medicine, including with a special expertise in the history of disciplines. Fallon was due to present an early version of this talk to the HBS seminar here at the University of Melbourne, but it had to be postponed due to an earthquake. So I can say that seismic events at least slow Fallon down, but I am particularly looking forward to hearing the presentation of Fallon now. So I'll hand on over to you.
Thanks, Martin. No pressure. Let me just start by successfully sharing screen. All right, so I should begin by saying I timed myself earlier and I was just over 15 minutes, so I'm going to solve that by talking really quickly. And I thought the place to start would actually be to talk about why I'm giving this talk and a little bit about me. So as Martin mentioned, my background is in history and philosophy of science, in particular as a historian of 20th century medicine. And after submitting my PhD, I did find myself working on Fiona Fiedler's Replicates project, and thus began what I can only say was a very rapid initiation into the world of meta-research and the growing community responses to the replication crisis at the time. So what I'm presenting today covers the wide-ranging but in-depth historiographical or literature review I've been undertaking as part of a grant application that I'm writing, where I'm interested in tracing 20th century research practices with a particular focus on errors and error detection. So as such, in historical speak, I'm presenting you with a historiographical analysis rather than original or empirical research. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term historiography in a nutshell, is a critical examination of how historians have analyzed and interpreted evidence to construct arguments or make conclusions about their objects of study in the past. So for the rest of the talk, I thought I will briefly outline why the analysis and approaches that I use might not be familiar or intuitive for the bulk of you in the audience who I imagine are practicing scientists, and I'll give you a little bit of insight into this division, which I think is important as this session is as much about bridge building across epistemic communities. And then for the time I have left, I will begin with how I have characterized meta-research, give you a glimpse at the scope of the existing literature that I have been scoping. And then, because there isn't time to be exhaustive, we'll focus on a particular aspect of sketching how historians have understood the post-war development of the social sciences. So I think this is a fruitful place to start, given the social sciences has been at the epicenter of the replication crisis and the subsequent responses to it. And so I will conclude by shedding my historian's hat or walking into more uncomfortable space for historians and reflecting on, the gaps and the silences in our historical knowledge, but also think about how we could reflect on the historical work and how that might prompt us as a wider meta-research community as we collectively sort of imagine our futures. So first, I said this might not be the history you were expecting. It will not begin in 2005 with the publication of, say, John Inedis's paper, nor in 2011 with the events catalyzed by Daniel Ben's paper either. And that is because the historian's approach will differ from that of the individuals within the meta-research community as we grapple with and make sense of our lived experiences. So it's worth pointing out at this juncture that historians and practitioners have had a historically fraught set of relationships. Practitioners and trained academic historians rarely approach each other's work with generosity. And it's important to note that the source of this tension is usually about method and revolves around things like self-reflexivity and or an acknowledgement of the limitations of one's interpretive gaze. Practitioners who turn their mind to history sometimes employ narrative tropes or rose-tinted views, particularly when undertaking biographical and autobiographical work, which has rightfully drawn criticism for overlooking or sidestepping deeply problematic aspects of some accounts or the subject of their history. And this could include anything from racism and misogyny to corruption and violence, to name a few. And I speak with some experience because this is possibly best illustrated in my home field, the history of medicine, that today effectively has two strands of medical history telling with very little overlap. And to my mind, this has been to the detriment of both communities, impeding fruitful dialogue as well as application of history to medical research and training. So in the case of disciplinary histories and or intellectual histories, which is closer to the topic of interest here, practitioners typically offer progressivist or what historians might call a Whiggish narrative that present the development of a field in a neat chronology of progression or predestiny. And I feel confident that you can instinctively appreciate that this is not necessarily reflective of the meandering, messy, crisscrossing path that describes any historical episode, let alone the history of a discipline, an idea, a concept, or a practice when you're taking or looking at it from a longer perspective across space and time. So recently, however, some historians have begun to appreciate the role of what Duncan Bell calls, quote, discipline-defining mythologies as a crucial component of this discourse, but also its role, the work that it does as a legitimizing strategy that consolidates or helps build self-identification within communities and emerging communities. For meta-research, this may include any number of items that I have on this list, which is by no means an attempt to be exhaustive. For historians, these narratives would constitute part of the discourse or set of what we would call primary source materials that we may draw upon. But the historian will rightfully be wary of seeing these narratives as full explanations for the emergence of the, for example, contemporary meta-research movement itself. So where then and when to begin was the question that I posed myself. And so periodization, in my view, marks that point of departure from contemporary meta-research narratives and their very legitimate place and role in the meta-research project, to how someone such as myself might approach placing the meta-research project in wider or longer historical perspective. So first, and I couldn't get away with this, I think it's important for me to offer up my own working interpretation or characterization of meta-research. This will allow you to understand and better appraise the remainder of my talk, because my approach to the broader question of placing the meta-research project in historical perspective is naturally informed by how I have defined or characterized meta-research. So here it is. My working interpretation is that meta-research describes the community of individuals and organizations actively participating in the intellectual, social, political, and cultural project of improving the credibility of scientific research. And in this definition, or characterization, if you like, I'm allowing for both what is as well as what could be. I'm allowing for the knowledge complexes and knowledge practices that currently describe the meta-research community, but also I'm acknowledging that these will continue to be dynamic, not static. I'm also accounting for the self-identification of individuals and organizations within the meta-research project, allowing for the reality that some actors will continue to engage in work that speaks to and shares significant overlap with meta-research goals, but that these actors prioritize different end goals and do not wish to enter into dialogue or collaborative work with meta-research communities. And finally, I'm sort of deliberately choosing to use meta-research and not meta-science, not because I'm attributing ownership of the term to a particular epistemic community, but rather because I believe that the word research, not science, better captures or describes the plurality of character of the individuals and organizations who currently actively participate in the meta-research project, as well as the ongoing dialogue and bridges being extended to intellectual and political communities. So essentially, I think meta-research to me is a more encompassing term. So with that, it's worth noting that the definition that I'm offering differs a little bit from several definitions that have been forwarded, and I'm just using some examples that I've found here. For example, the science of science, Metascience as a scientific social movement. A lot of the definitions which place equal emphasis on the tools or the methods used, i.e. scientific quantitative tools, as it does to the end goals themselves, which to me signals, or describes who constitutes the current majority member of meta-research communities, as well as how meta-research work has been imagined. And I note a notable departure with Metascience 2021, which to me captures, that dynamic, evolving nature of the project, and the aspiration and the progress that is already being made. So, returning to my characterization and sort of the second half of what I said I would talk to you about, so to me, the historiography I've been examining is much more dispersed and not completely shaped by current constructions of what does or doesn't constitute meta-research work. Instead, to help organize sort of how I went about doing this, I used an approach of considering knowledge practices and knowledge complexes to begin to explore post-war historical developments that can help contextualize or help us understand the present. And so the body of work by predominantly historians that I have been exploring falls under, these following broad areas, which should feel very familiar or comfortable to you. I obviously don't have time to take you through an exhaustive thematic analysis of each of these areas. So in the time I have left, I thought I would just briefly outline one aspect of my analysis, which was one that I think has been overlooked, and that is how we might understand the post-war development of the social sciences before finishing with some sort of takeaways or lessons from these histories for understanding or making sense of our present. Okay, so far my reading and my analysis has suggested that the geopolitical upheaval of World War II and the post-war decades of Reconstruction really do comprise a watershed moment for the social sciences. And I'll draw on the work of Roger Backhouse and Philippe Fontaine, who have been two prolific scholars in the history of social science, who have argued that the unprecedented displacement of European academics, together with the particular research demands of the war effort, saw a consolidation of the modern social sciences, as well as an emergence of the United States as a key nation state in shaping disciplinary development, particularly in universities. But they warn that it's necessary to understand the development of these individual disciplines as being in relations or entanglements with each other. So in an introduction to a special issue published in 2015, Fontaine summarizes what the growing body of historical scholarship in the last decade or so has increasingly begun to question, which is the popularly held belief of how separate and tightly demarcated post-1945 social science disciplinary boundaries actually were, arguing that this in fact might be an artifact of how and who wrote early disciplinary histories, as you can see from this quote that I've put up here. Through sort of in-depth analysis of the American, British, and French systems in particular, Fontaine and Backhouse argue that the historical record documenting disciplinary histories has tended to ignore what they have very neatly called interdisciplinary chaos. And through an examination of over 250 cross-disciplinary research institutes or efforts in the post-war decades, with psychology and economic scholars being prominent in these collaborations, they make a strong case for the extent of the influence of cross-disciplinary collaboration catalyzed both by World War II and the Cold War. And they argue that, quote, cross-disciplinarity should be understood as the struggle by various social sciences to force their own conception of society on each other so as to emerge as the main providers of solutions to its problems. So this is, on the back of a rapid, unprecedented development of universities and this vision that nation states had about the role of education and universities in post-war Reconstruction too. And Mark Solovey's edited volume extends this analysis of the role that both the World War II and Cold War had to a transnational exploration of Cold War social sciences, covering countries like the Philippines, China, and Japan, again demonstrating how Cold War research priorities and McCarthyism, for example, reconfigured social science objects from its methods to its goals. And of course, critical to these reconfigurations was the emergent funding environment, and the success of the social sciences, as these histories show, was a shift in emphasis to, quote, technical, non-partisan, and value-neutral professional expertise, which in turn manifested in a majority commitment to logical positivism, and with an emphasis on testability and quantification. But historian of education Helen Lagerman reflects that some of this development in the post-war decades was uncritically done, noting of early educationists, for example, that they, quote, failed to realize that their goals might have been better served by instead pondering what distinctive characteristics might comprise rigor and relevance in a particular domain of scholarship. And she draws attention to the fact that early educationists accepted and perpetuated myopia as common to their world, especially biases concerning race, ethnicity, and gender. And finally, I'm very much running out of time, so I will wrap up. Joel Isaac's done a bunch of interesting studies on tool shop, which I will skip in favor of the next slide, but I just would like to say that he tentatively suggests that this concept of tool shock has been understudied, but might be critical to understanding the mathematization of the social sciences. So where are the silences and the gaps in the literature? Of course, the historical work needs to be extended out into the 1990s and into the global South. But the work really reminded me that, and Helen Lagerman's work in particular reminded me of the fact that colonial legacies are still implicit, and history, just like a lot of other disciplines, have a lot of work to redress how we do interpret the past, and how we perpetuate these silences and these myopias. So to very, very quickly conclude, what do future collaborations with historians look like? Well, we have a specific set of skills that we can bring to any object or subject of inquiry, and I've just noted a couple of things here. I think there's a lot of interest and implications for considering the role of interdisciplinary chaos, especially as increasingly meta-researchers or the meta-research project is seeing its place as bridging across disciplines and disciplinary practices. But I think the one that I was left most struck with, and earlier today in Brian Nosek's plenary, someone brought up citizen science as an example of a community we could seek to build greater ties with. And now I'm talking about meta-research communities, and I agree. But I would propose that in critically reading the historiography and its silences, it occurred to me yet again, and with a lot of force, that an equal, if not higher, imperative would be engaging with critical Indigenous scholars across disciplines, many of whom are leading the way in disrupting colonial legacies within academia, as well as engaging with Indigenous communities and their knowledge systems as we consider how we shape meta-research agendas in the future, and particularly whose voices and needs do and should meta-research communities seek out to collaborate with, privilege, and serve. I'm well over time, so I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Fallon. And I should have mentioned in the introduction that all of the things that I said were true, and Fallon has also been the driving force behind now not just one, but two AMOS conferences. So just a reminder, we'll have a general question time after this, but if you've got any very specific questions or comments to make, please do drop them into chat. But we'll move to Felipe Romero speaking on the many faces of scientific self-correction. Felipe is assistant professor in the Department of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Groningen, working on understanding how the social organization of research activities affects research outcomes, with a recent focus on how incentive structures influence scientific self-correction in the social and behavioral sciences. Felipe also organizes workshops to foster conversations involving meta-scientists, practicing scientists, and philosophers of science. So over to you, Felipe.
Okay, let's see, this should be working. Yeah, thank you all for being here. And I also want to thank the AMOS committee for inviting me. It's a great chance to try out some ideas and see what people think. And let me start by giving you a little bit of context about how I see the connections between some of the work that we do in philosophy of science and discussions about replicability and meta-science. So I think it took some time for philosophers of science to notice the momentous importance of the replicability crisis. However, at this point, we can find a lot of philosophical work looking at different aspects of replication, the open science movement, publication practices, and so on. So there's definitely some interest from the philosophy of science side to engage with some meta-scientific concerns. How about the other direction, from meta-science to philosophy of science? So I think during the past 10 years, we have seen a lot of very interesting developments. And I think this is the right time to start reflecting on the significance of meta-science for philosophy of science. So more specifically, I think that all the work that we have seen in the past 10 years and the emergence of meta-science itself requires us to update philosophical theories about how science works. One of the reasons for this is that there is a non-trivial overlap between the two fields. So some of the questions that the scientists ask are clearly philosophical questions, right? Questions about the nature of scientific error, the nature of scientific progress. So maybe this might be a bit of news for you, but yes, meta-scientists, some of you are actually doing philosophy of science. So that's great, keep that up. Of course, meta-scientific tools and methods are very different, and I think they're complementary. And this is the part that I find interesting, that some of the insights there can help us when we do philosophy of science, and hopefully the other way around too, right? So I think this sort of reflection has payoffs for both philosophy and meta-science. So what I'm going to do is focus on one particular issue that has been discussed widely in philosophy, and that is also one of the big concerns for meta-scientists today, and is the question of whether science is self-correcting. So most philosophers and scientists believe in what we could call the self-corrective thesis, right? So the thesis that science will correct its errors in the long run. However, in light of the replicability crisis, it is not clear whether science is self-correcting. So maybe you might be more, or there are different levels of optimism that you could have with respect to that matter. But if science is self-correcting, it is not in the way in which philosophical theories would predict. And I find that very interesting. So the question is, how does the replicability crisis affect our philosophical understanding of scientific self-correction? So here's the plan. So I'm gonna very quickly talk about many things, but in general, I'm just gonna be proposing that we should see scientific self-correction in three levels. So the first one is what I'm gonna call the first order, a statistical level of self-correction, which is what most philosophers, I think, have focused on. And then I'm gonna talk about second order self-correction that takes into account methodological concerns, more broadly speaking, and then also institutional self-correction. And then I'm gonna very quickly talk about implications of that idea of these three levels for theories of scientific progress. Okay, so let me start with the first level. So the self-corrective thesis. So when you look at the history of science, you can see explicit discussions of science as self-correcting, at least going back to the 17th century, right? So this is a very old idea. Already in the beginnings of modern science, scientists had the idea that the science was a self-correcting enterprise. In philosophy of science, you can see this idea more clearly articulated in the work of Charles Sanders Peirce. So he says, for instance, that science is predestined to reach the truth in an ideal limit of inquiry. And he grounds this belief in the idea that science uses self-corrective methods. And Peirce was very interested in quantitative induction, right? So that's the term that he uses for the inference from samples to populations. So he says, well, this is a method which steadily persisted in must lead to true knowledge in the long run of cases of its application. And you can wonder, well, you know, science does a lot of different things, not only quantitative inductions. And I think the hope for Peirce and also for other thinkers in this tradition, for instance, Hans Reichenbach, is that other forms of inference are reducible in some way. And of course, it's a very tricky matter, a controversial matter, but these other forms of inference are reducible to quantitative induction. So Reichenbach, for instance, says the method of scientific inquiry may be considered as a concatenation of quantitative inductive inferences. So here's a perhaps more concise formulation of the self-corrective thesis as these authors were seeing it at the time. So in the long run, and again, we don't know how long that long run is, but in the long run, the scientific method will refute false theories and find closer approximations to true theories. Now, it is worth noticing that the way in which we work these days with inferential statistics embodies these ideas of self-correction, right? So in modern science, you can see the parallels, for instance, in the way in which many of the quantitative projects work. So ideally, given a series of replications of an experiment, the meta-analytical aggregation of their effect sizes will eventually converge on the true effect size, right? So in current practice, this is mostly done with frequency statistics. So I'm going to call this first order self-correction. So here's a very simple simulation example of how this works, right? So I'm thinking this audience, most of you are very familiar with this. So imagine that you have a scientific community. They are doing a series of replications. They are interested in the same effect. They're trying to find one particular effect size. Then hopefully they will do a lot of replications. Then you have a cumulative meta-analysis that is going to nicely converge on the true value. Now we know, of course, that this process fails in practice. And that's what a lot of research, I think, that we have seen in the last years can be framed as research on how this process fails. And that's why I think we have to think about self-correction as something that involves more than that first order self-correcting process. So that first order self-correcting process faces problems of application, right? So p-hacking, small samples, motivated reasoning, errors in reporting, and so on. So one way of seeing this is that you could have really good statistical methods, right? So let's say here you have a very sharp knife, right? But if it's deployed in the wrong context, a context in which you have these problems, then the process is not going to work. The first order process is not going to work, right? So you need a proper cutting board, so to speak. So self-correction requires methodological corrections, right? So, and we have seen a lot of work on this, right? Tools that detect and to some extent correct first order errors, for instance, by assessing the evidential value of sets of findings or finding errors in the statistics reported in papers, reducing researcher degrees of freedom. And I think we can view these tools as second order self-correction because they correct errors that can't be corrected in the first order level. Now, you might think also, and this is not uncontroversial, that methods themselves are defective, that inference methods themselves are defective. And this is a point that I think has been suggested in multiple ways when it comes to frequentist statistics, right? So frequentist statistics, and particularly null hypothesis significant testing can introduce errors such as the overestimation of effect sizes. And then you can think, well, maybe self-correction requires correcting inference methods and tools themselves, right? Improving the way in which we do frequentist statistics, for instance, one alternative, equivalent testing based on statistics. You know, you can plug there your favorite statistical reform. So here's one example of how that could go. So here, so imagine again that you have this community of scientists interested in finding one effect. They are working with sufficient resources to find that effect. Then if they are working with limited resources like smaller samples, then you see large overestimations in the cases when you use frequentist statistics. So you can think of correcting that way of working, perhaps using Bayesian statistics. And you can say, well, when you use Bayesian statistics, you don't have that problem with large overestimations, right? So this is, of course, not a very clean picture. A lot of details are going to matter, right? So for instance, you can see that convergence here is slower, right? So there's a lot to be said about that, but this is one example of how you can think of correcting the first order self-correcting mechanism. Okay. Now, institutional self-correction. So suppose that you solve all the problems that I mentioned before. So suppose that you have the best statistics, suppose that you don't worry too much about those problems of application. However, there is still a big issue which is that the incentives to do self-corrective work are very weak. So self-corrective work is not systematic. And self-corrective work is primarily reactive, right? So there's a lot of interest, and you can see instances of self-corrective work happening. But I think what I have seen during the past years is mostly a reaction to a problem, right? And I think we should start thinking about self-correction more as a standard practice when it comes to these three levels. So what is the root of this problem? Well, I think that scientific institutions, so career guidelines, resource allocation scheme, publication practices, discourage systematic self-corrective work. And perhaps the clearest example at this point is this implicit norm, the priori rule, that says that we should reward primarily novel discoveries, and this comes at the expense of replication efforts, for instance. Now, another problem that is related to this one is that even if the self-correcting process at the first order level, second order levels are working, there is evidence that suggests that it is hard to assimilate. So assimilating correction is difficult, and I think institutions should help us when it comes to do that, right? So we have to acknowledge that even if we do like very nice, tight, pre-registered, multi-site experiments that tells us or give us very decisive information, the community is not gonna quickly assimilate it. So we have to think about the role that institutions have to play to help us assimilate error correction. So in particular with the case of replications, so here are some ideas. So or at least we can frame some of these ideas as forms of correcting institutions. If you want to incentivize replication, there are different things that different stakeholders can do. Universities and departments can tailor and promotion guidelines to acknowledge replication research. And of course, like some of these things are already happening. Governments and private funders, they can allocate study funding for replication research, require multi-site work. Journals and editors, of course, play a huge role here. Publishing multi-site register reports, publishing reproducibility reports. Professional societies, they can identify what's worth replicating in each subfield, define subfield-specific confirmation guidelines. Okay, so that was very quickly. So this idea of viewing self-correction as a process that involves 3 levels and not only this first order statistical level. So now let me tell you a bit of what I think this implies for theories of scientific progress. So, so scientific progress requires error correction. So one question that you can ask is, what is the relation between these different levels that I presented and theories of scientific progress? And there are like 2 classes of theories here that we can refer to in the philosophical literature. So one is what can be called one-process theories. So the work of Karl Popper here is one example. So Popper would say that scientific change is a cycle of conjectures and refutations, right? So you repeat that process, you make one conjecture, you refute it, and whatever survives is what constitutes progress. Then on the other hand, you have the work of Kuhn, Lakatos, and Loudon is perhaps the main reference. So you have one process, so you have changes within a general framework, a paradigm, a program. And then the second process is changes at the level of frameworks themselves, right? So these are like big revisions in the way in which scientists conceptualize the problems that they study. And I think what is important to notice here is that this theory describes the dynamics of knowledge and the dynamics of scientific changes as changes in the content of scientific theories. And I think one of the big lessons that we have from the advent of metascience is that changes in the context of the theories is only a part of what science needs to self-correct, right? So because these changes are mostly related to first order self-correction. Okay, so to wrap up, so there's a classic understanding of scientific self-correction that is limited to the process of correcting statistical inference and the content that you can derive from them. And I think in addition to this understanding, the replicability crisis and the advent of metascience reveal that science needs to correct methods and institutional arrangements as well. And I think this is just a great opportunity for us in philosophy to revise some of these theories about scientific progress and adjustments, and I think interdisciplinary work will be very welcome to do this revision. So yeah, that's what I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felipe. And, if everyone can join me in whatever way they can in thanking all of the speakers for a fantastic presentation. We've got, we are moving into a collective discussion time now, and then we'll move into breakout rooms where you'll get a chance to have a bit more, sort of in-depth chat with the individual speakers. I'd suggest that we go for, we've got half an hour left in this session. I suggest we go for about 10 minutes of collective discussion and then 3 by 5 minutes rotating breakout rooms, and then come back at the end. And what I'm going to ask you to do when we come back at the end, before you go off to the next session, how to start a revolution in your discipline, is to just, before you leave, after you finish your breakout rooms, drop your, sort of what you found the most interesting, the thoughts, your insights, what you've liked, questions you've had into the chat before you leave, so that we've got a record for that now. But we're now open to questions from the floor, and we've got some in chat. Feel free to use the hand. Alex, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for all those excellent talks. So the first talk I came in partway through, sorry, Remco, was yours. So you might have addressed this a bit, but I was thinking that possibly the benefits of open peer review, rather than just being in aggregating quality ratings or even a multidimensional thing, which is just the amount of new qualitative comments that can be read by the scientific community. I feel like that could possibly even dwarf the benefits of just getting a less noisy estimate of quality in some way. For example, when I am interested in following up on a particular paper, there's so much value to me in just being able to read everything and anything that anyone's ever thought about this particular paper before my laboratory is going to invest a huge amount of resources. And no number of like how externally valid is this study, or how vulnerable is it to something, or to other sorts of inferences, is going to help me nearly as much as the qualitative comments I think that I can potentially read, and the more the better. So could that, can you imagine arguing for that as possibly being the biggest benefit of open peer review?
Yeah, right. So I missed a few words here and there, so I'm not sure I got everything you said, but I think that I would interpret that as a highly sympathetic comment, right? So when you open up peer review, you make available not just papers that might be rejected under the current journal model, that are now just somewhere out there for people to find and somehow benefit from, but also all the little ideas that maybe aren't worth writing a paper about, but that you end up writing in a peer review, right? A peer review often ends up being itself kind of short argument or a short sort of scientific contribution in its own right. Especially the longer reviews are sometimes verge on reply pieces, and there can be like little gems of insight there that we can now, if we open this all up, we can all benefit from those if we manage to find them at least. Yeah, so that's just a part of the benefit of opening up, is getting in this, I used the word more democratic at one point, just the idea of like bringing in more insights from different directions, maybe dislodging groupthink as it might affect some disciplines on occasion, is definitely part of what we're hoping to get out of pushing in this direction.
Thank you.
Comments on that from Fallon or Felipe? Jennifer Burns got a question in chat to all of the panelists. I'm wondering whether speakers can comment on the speed of self-correction in science. Humanity doesn't have endless time to sort out the planet's problems. How can self-correction happen faster? Let's jump in on that first.
Yeah, I'm impatient.
So maybe I can say something about that. So perhaps the first thing that I could say is perhaps the rather unsatisfactory philosopher's answer, right? That when we look at science and the history of science, the time scales are huge, right? And then it could take, decades, centuries to see some of the bigger corrections happening. However, I think from a more practical perspective, I think it is, or this is just a very personal way of seeing things. I think we first have to come to terms with the idea that we can't self-correct or correct everything, right? And we have to think of science perhaps as being on the whole not very self-corrective, but we can perhaps focus, and this is going to depend on a lot of interests that people have that are perhaps more practical than purely epistemic, focus on the specific aspects or theories or problems that we would like to have a reliable science for. And this is why I think having these interventions, institutional interventions, are necessary, kind of to gear the efforts of the community towards like those particular issues that we want to correct.
Maybe I'll just say really quickly, where Felipe is focusing on the long time scale, if I'm focusing just quickly on the very short time scale, if you move from pre-publication peer review to post-publication peer review, there's that little window of the actual time of peer review that you win, in a sense of getting stuff out there for a broader audience more quickly. So that's a small little speed gain that we might win there.
All efficiency gains are good gains. Fallon?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I'm probably more in line with Felipe, where my interest has been about where and how self-correction has occurred and within epistemic communities, and how perhaps we can bring some of that into understanding what's worked in the past as a way of past proofing, if you like, interventions or policies that are being developed for now or for contemporary scholarship. But I can't also help but be influenced by the argument that faster self-correction relies on funding error detection work and changing the cultures around how that work is received. And that's me shedding my historian's hat completely. But I think other people in the room have made that argument quite convincingly, and I'm indeed convinced.
Okay, Pranali's got your hand up for a question or comment?
Yes, hello. I wanted to ask in regards to self-correction, whether, if you have an application for a basic research. So I am from neuroscience, and I see a lot of times something which is in one paper, if you had looked at a separate subfield in neuroscience, you could see that logically it does not make sense, like this finding doesn't corroborate with the finding in another subfield kind of. So in that sense, could there be like, logical ways in which you could self-correct, not just look at like, the finding the methods and everything, but whether it fits into the larger picture of what you're studying? Because a lot of the times, even within like one field like neuroscience or something, interdisciplinary talk is not there, like somebody's doing something on genetics but not in brain imaging or something, and sometimes that data doesn't make sense with each other. Could that be a way to assess validity of papers?
That's possibly to you first, Felipe.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on that, which I think probably are going to be Remco's thoughts on that too, right? So I'm thinking about the of course there is an important mechanism that involves using different methodologies, right? And triangulation, I guess, is the one of the terms. And I think as a matter of practice, I think this works, right? I think the interesting challenge is to think about it. I guess you mentioned this in your question. There isn't kind of like a clear logic to that, right? Like clear procedure of how that is supposed to go, right? But it's definitely like one like self-corrective mechanism for sure.
So because I was wondering, most of the time in peer review, the papers go to like very specific subfield, and people who do research also read or would review papers in their specific subfield. So people who have broader knowledge would be able to do this much more easily.
Yeah. Maybe I can just say that, like, I think it'd be really good if there was this kind of broad perspective of sort of how, if more people had this kind of broad perspective of sort of how things hang together, and if different discoveries in different sub areas might be at least seemingly in contradiction with each other. I think it's really good to bring that out to see, like, but to stimulate further research, right? Like, I would not want to go too far in the direction of trying to rule out findings in one field because they seem to contradict with findings in another field. You don't want to squash the diversity too quickly, because that might actually be really harmful to progress. You might have a core theory that's sort of self-consistent with the findings in all the fields, or you might have really great theories in all the different subfields, and we haven't really quite figured out how they hang together yet. I'd perhaps rather be in the second situation.
Okay. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
I wanted to ask how much can, application-based things could be used for self-correction? Like, I know, like, some basic research definitely doesn't have direct application to test things, but some could have. And, could there be like a system where if there is like something you can, like, because application-based research is like less likely to get things wrong because, it won't work when you try to use it.
So maybe I can say something that perhaps speaks to your question, which is, and I will perhaps frame this in the ideas that I was mentioning about institutions, and I think accountability, right? So I think that's the word that comes to mind for me, right? When I compare different fields, right? So you mentioned like more applied fields. I also think some of these pressures, you can also see them in fields in which, given that the research is so expensive, for instance, then the researchers have to be more transparent, just to address the very practical problem of reporting what they are doing with the funds, right? So this happens in applied research, this happens in very expensive research, for instance, in physics. And I think that's a huge factor that can help with transparency, which is going to result in perhaps an increased capacity to identify and correct errors, right? So I think to the extent that we can make, that we can learn from those contexts, the applied context, about how they implement accountability, then I think we can help other fields.
Thank you.
We're starting to get a few more questions through chat, including one massive bomb from Fiona Fiddler. Can I just do a quick poll as to who here would like to go into a breakout room, has got particular questions they'd like to ask particular speakers, or are we happy just continuing a collective chat? If you would particularly like to go into a breakout room and talk to an individual speaker, could you, sort of give me some kind of emoji, sort of soon? Otherwise, we might just continue on the collective discussion time, because we are starting to run out of time in this session. I'm not seeing a lot of love here for individual breakout rooms, and that, sort of might be poor, survey methodology coming in here. But let's go over to Fiona Fiddler's, sort of, this we can sort this out in 17 minutes, I'm sure. What, if anything, can the philosophies of theory, the philosophies of science, philosophical theories of scientific change, like Kuhn or Lakatos, tell us about the actualities of methodological change in the here and now? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Maybe I can try something. Yeah. So I like the if anything part of your question, Fiona. Because in my most cynical days, I I do wonder, right? So how much of what we have there is actually helpful, right? So it's not necessarily a problem, right? To the extent that, of course, the work that we do in these other fields doesn't need to be directly concerned with, helping the researchers, but maybe here is something that I can say on the side of Kuhn, right? So I think when you think about revolutions on the framework of Kuhn, so these seem to be like very not very frequent events in the history of science, right? So this happened like happened only a few times in the history of modern science. Perhaps, and this is an open question and one that I've been interested in for some time already, is the question of whether we are actually living one of those moments, right? Of one of these big moments of transition, one revolution, so to speak. And I think maybe that's not going to help the practitioner, right? But like directly doing their work, but perhaps it can help them view and acknowledge the importance of the moment that they are living in, like the largest scheme of things, right? But again, it's an open question, right? Whether we are actually living a Kuhnian revolution or not.
Yeah, sorry, Fiona.
Sorry, I'll just say out loud what it's not that, do you think Kuhn can really explain what's happening now, or are those old theories relevant to the times we're in now? I mean, it's my question, which I perhaps didn't phrase properly because I'm not entirely sure how to articulate it, but these theories about, or these philosophies of theory or paradigm change, right? It's not the same. We're talking about kind of methodological change. It's a different thing, right? Isn't it?
I think I disagree a little bit with the premise of the question, which may also mean I'm disagreeing a little bit with Felipe's framing of things in his talk, in the sense that, like, if you're interpreting Kuhn in particular, I think if you're interpreting him as just talking about self-correction at that first order level, as Felipe characterized it, I think that strikes me as an impoverished reading. Like, I think when Kuhn describes a paradigm, my understanding from memory of reading this a long time ago is that he does include in that not just particular theories, but definitely also methodological ways, ways of approaching problems in particular. And then you're definitely into the methodological area at that point, right? Whether that gives any practical payoffs for Metascience, I can't confidently say, but I do think that his notion of paradigm and paradigm change is at least intending to also capture the kind of changes that Metascience might strive for.
Yeah, like I know it. I'm glad you said that. I was expecting that response. Is that, of course, a paradigm entails methods as well as theories, but we're not talking about theories here at all. It's it's particular methods divorced from theory. It still seems to me different. What we're talking.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but Fiona, but surely part of that question is that that whole idea that normal science is broken is not quite explanatory enough, because Paul Meehl showed us the normal inferential statistics were broken in the 70s, and we knew they were broken in the 80s and the 90s, and so just to know enough that they're broken is not enough to get the change that we require, is it? So, but Fallon, surely you're sitting there quietly. I know you have thoughts on these questions.
Not ones that I feel I can comfortably articulate at 7:19, but I think it's really hard for me to divorce myself from my own HPS training, and on my worst days I would struggle to even remember or articulate the differences between Kuhn and Popper, because by the time I reached History and Philosophy of Science, particularly as it's taught at the University of Melbourne, we were talking about philosophies of science in practice, and you know, we were talking about plurality of methods and had moved on. So I think I feel like I'm so far divorced from thinking about this in any meaningful way that I have absolutely nothing useful to contribute. And that's my really honest answer is, yeah, I'm just a product of the way we were taught HPS and the time I was taught HPS.
So maybe I can add something. So I think I think I agree with you, Fiona, and this is something that perhaps I had in a previous version of the talk and in this extended version of this project. But I agree. So there are several things that are not happening, right? That according to the Kuhnian framework. So there isn't like incommensurability. There isn't changes in like overarching like theoretical frameworks, right? So if that's what perhaps one would expect from the Kuhnian views, right? The changes, I think, maybe it's a way of reconciling something that Remco was saying. So Kuhn, yes, maybe he would conceive a framework as this very big overarching thing, but I think it's a matter of emphasis, right? And now, I guess what I wanted to emphasize is that it's interesting about what's happening these days is mostly on methodological changes and institutional changes, as opposed to like theoretical changes, right? Now, this is a subtlety, but these small theoretical changes that I associate with the first order self-correction are not the sort of big, paradigm transformations that Kuhn had in mind. So I don't know if this is a way of perhaps reconciling some of the things that Fiona and Remco were saying, but I think it's a matter of emphasis, right? So I think that tradition has emphasized too much the content of theories at the expense of changes in methodologies and so on. So maybe in that respect, it's not really informative to say what's happening when it comes to methodological changes and institutional changes.
Well, I was going to say, there's only about 10 minutes to sort that one out. I think we've done pretty well. We'll move on to, there's another question from Mel Marie in chat. I will encourage people, please do, before you leave this session or go on to the next session, please do leave your reflections in chat, so we've got a good record of it. If you've this interesting question or provocation or something that you've learned today, please just drop it into chat, so we've got a good record of it. But Mel Marie's question is, I can see the appeal of post-peer review for the scientific community, but I'm worried about the implications for policy or applied practice, e.g. clinical practice. I can imagine that we will see more instances of poor findings getting translated more quickly, as we already saw for some preprints. I'm not opposed to post-publication peer review per se, but would be interested in the speaker's thoughts about this. So that's probably for you, Remco, in the first instance.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I agree. It's something that we should, worry about, think about, experiment with if we're trying to sort of roll out some form of post-publication peer review on a bigger scale. I guess I would say that here's some sort of, a bit of provocation maybe, or speculation, why you might think it could just as easily go the other direction, right? In the journal system, a poor finding that does manage to squeak its way through peer review somehow might then land in a top journal and suddenly get a lot of attention. And then we're in trouble, right? Because now it's out there in a fancy journal and people are going to take it really seriously. Whereas any new paper in a post-publication peer review system has to start from nothing, right? It doesn't have any endorsements until people start reviewing it and rating it highly. So whether that might actually prevent the sort of the worst findings from ever being picked up by people with applications in mind, relative outsiders, not sort of the immediate inner circle of people engaged with the particular topic at hand in their academic research. So I don't know. We'd have to find out and see how it plays out and see whether we can tweak things in a way to make it work as well as possible.
Further comments on that question from panelists? Do we have any other questions or comments from the floor? Do go for a quick wrap up from the speakers, you know, sort of maybe in reverse order. Felipe, you got final reflections on this session?
Well, what can I say? It's just great. So I think from, you know, a personal perspective, I think is very positive to see like the connections that are emerging like between like fields, right? So this was definitely something that I think wasn't happening 10 years ago. Yeah, so I think it is good to see like these communication and see how different fields can say something relevant to the other fields. So, you know, spaces like this are just great for that. So yeah, that's, I guess, what I can say.
Fallon, closing reflections?
Yeah, I think this has probably been the first time I've presented to a group of scientists rather than groups of historians or medical historians in particular, and I was definitely nervous about it. I should have mentioned that if anyone would like my full reading list, because you have a particular subtopic that you would like to have a starting pack with, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to share my rather extensive bibliography. And I suppose if you have any particular questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to get in touch. I think I probably should have mentioned that part of what I'm interested in is a comparison between sort of the 20th century development of the social sciences and comparing that to the development of biomedical research practices, which I already understand fairly well given my PhD. So that was sort of the genesis for the direction that I took the talk in, but I would love any feedback that anyone has. I'll hand over to Remco. Final thoughts?
Yeah, Remco, Heesen, last words for this session?
Thanks. Yeah, this is really nice. I think it's if I remember correctly, we have Fallon and Fiona to thank for the idea for this session. I might be misremembering, but it's really nice to have formats to sort of exchange across disciplinary boundaries, and also I think recruit in both directions. I would really love to see more philosophers engage with these questions, and also I would really hope that meta-scientists find it helpful to see what philosophers have to say about these topics. Felipe gave a few names and citations for where you might look for that sort of material. I see that there was another question for me in the chat, so I'll just quickly take that up as well. Benjamin Marshall asked, would the post-publication community peer review approach enable greater recognition for peer review effort? And I would say absolutely, right? As soon as you open up peer review, it becomes that much easier to give credit for peer review as well. I haven't emphasized that in my reflections here, but it's something that we could definitely have a greater range of experimentation with, right? You already see even in the journal system that sometimes now people are making some efforts to reward and recognize peer review. It would just be so much easier if you actually have signed reviews out there, then you can talk not just about the quantity, but also of the quality of review that people are doing. So yeah, there are lots of areas and reflections to think further about and experiment with. I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to contrast, I think, my talk with the earlier session where some other meta-scientists talked about alternative models of peer review. I didn't see it myself because I was asleep. I'm hoping to watch it back later. But if anyone was at both, I'd be interested to see what the contrasts and comparisons there were as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was a really great session, and I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're at time. So please do join me in whatever way you can, thanking the panelists and all of the people that participated. Feel free to unmute yourself very briefly to say thank you, and drop your reflections in the chat, and stay tuned for how to start a revolution in your discipline. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll start the next session very soon. I'll just give people a minute to come.